Heat bled from Sentinel Ale's jaw first, locking his mandibles in a rigid half-open state. He was a statue made of rapidly cooling meat. Across the bridge, the human, Vance, leaned against a console and yawned. The chronometer flashed crimson. Exactly 60 seconds remained. I had always believed the Sky Dynasty was untouchable. I was wrong. Would you have stayed to watch the end, or clawed for the escape pods? Because Vance didn't even look up from his watch. 6 hours earlier, the Sky Dynasty's pride was intact. I was conducting a routine inspection of the Dreadnought's primary engine core, noting the faint scent of ozone and recycled air. A week ago, the hardest decision I'd faced was whether to report a minor fluctuation in the waste reclamation system. The engine room of the Sun Eater was a cathedral of gold and obsidian. I moved through the humming silence, my crest held high. Protocol 4 Alpha dictated a secondary sweep of the reactor housing every 4 cycles. I followed it to the letter. I should note that I have spent 11 years arguing that Terran technology is statistically insignificant compared to our own. I am reconsidering. I paused near the primary cooling vent. A section of the pristine ivory paint was curling. It was a minor blemish, an insult to the Sky Dynasty's aesthetic. I reached out to scrape it away with a talon, but my vision narrowed to a single point of light. Underneath the ivory was a rough, charcoal-colored script. Human. I couldn't read the blocky characters yet, but the presence of graffiti in my engine room was concerning. "You guys really need to upgrade the firmware on your routers," a voice rasped. Vance was sitting on a technician's stool. His hands were bound by magnetic cuffs. He looked remarkably bored for a man whose planet was currently being blockaded by the largest fleet in the sector. "Sentinel," the guard growled. "The prisoner keeps requesting bandwidth. He says he cannot face execution without a stable connection." I looked at Vance. He yawned, his mouth stretching wide enough to show several metallic fillings. Humans are such porous, messy creatures. He was a dangerous saboteur. Well, he was an engineer who had been caught trying to hotwire a vending machine in the lower docks, but the Admiralty insisted on the higher classification. I need to be very clear that I followed every protocol during his intake. I have the documentation. Then the proximity siren screamed. A low hum, then nothing. The readings were consistent with a Class 9 thermal warhead. They were not. I need to start that sentence over. My vision narrowed as my crest flattened against my skull. My vision narrowed until the sensor display was the only thing in the universe. A single object was hurtling toward us at a significant fraction of light speed. "The trajectory suggests a suicide craft," I said. My voice was steady as per my training, but my talons were digging into the obsidian floor, locking into the defensive posture of my ancestors. "Actually," Vance said, leaning back and squinting at the flickering status lights, "it's just a bus. A very heavy, very fast bus. Your Wi-Fi is still trash, by the way." I ignored him. My reputation as the most meticulous sentinel in the fleet was at stake, and if this report reached the high command before my reassignment, I would be lucky to end up as a waste scrubber. I remember thinking that the flickering overhead light in the corridor really needed a new filament. It was a standard G-type bulb. Maintenance keeps saying they'll get to it. I focused on the smudge on my data pad instead of the incoming death. It was simpler that way. The bridge was a chaotic swirl of bioluminescent distress signals and officers shouting over the din of the proximity klaxon. Our tactical computers were attempting to hack the incoming projectile, cycling through millions of electronic disruption codes per second. It was a masterpiece of Sky Dynasty engineering, and it was entirely useless. Vance watched the tactical screen with the detached interest of a man watching a slow-moving rain cloud. "You're trying to find a backdoor in the software," Vance said, his voice cutting through the panic like a dull blade. "The thing is, there isn't any software. Well, there are some basic thrusters for guidance, but you're trying to negotiate with a bullet." I turned to him, my talons clicking rhythmically against the command console. It was a nervous habit I usually suppressed. I need to start that sentence over. It was a nervous habit that I didn't have until 10 minutes ago. "Explain," I commanded. "Kinetic kill vehicles," he said, popping a joint in his neck. "No warhead, No fancy electronics to fry with your EMPs. It's just a dense tungsten core with a few steering jets to keep it on target. It's a bus-sized rock moving at 30,000 kilometers per second. It doesn't need to explode. It just needs to arrive. I looked at the sensor data. The mass was incredible. It was a guided bullet, as he said, stripped of everything but momentum. The realization made my crest flatten so hard it began to ache. I'd spent my entire career preparing for sophisticated electronic warfare, for plasma shields and particle beams. I was not prepared for a very fast rock. I noticed a small scuff on Vance's left boot. It was a jagged tear in the synthetic leather, likely from when he was dragged into the holding cell. I found myself wondering if he had a spare pair in his quarters on Earth. The ship's AI began a frantic countdown for emergency evacuation. My future, the one involving a quiet retirement in the floating gardens of Aelcora, was evaporating. If we didn't move, we wouldn't even be dust. We would be a memory smeared across the stars. 60 seconds, the computer chimed. Heat bled from my jaw first, locking my mandibles in a rigid, half-open state. I was a statue made of rapidly cooling meat. The bridge was empty now, save for me and the human. The rest of the officers had already scrambled for the high-speed pods, their hawk-like grace abandoned for a frantic, flapping scramble. I stood paralyzed by the sheer, primitive audacity of the weapon. Vance checked his watch. He didn't look like a prisoner anymore. He looked like a spectator at a predictable play. He saw the way my limbs had locked, the biological fail-safe of my species when faced with an inescapable predator. "Relax," Vance said, his voice dropping into a low, terrifyingly calm register. "This will only hurt for the rest of your species' existence." He chuckled then. It wasn't a villainous laugh. It was the sound of someone who had seen the punchline coming from a light year away. The sound triggered something in my hindbrain, a spark of movement that broke the paralysis just long enough for me to lunge for the manual override of the final escape shuttle. My vision was a narrow tunnel of white light. I didn't even think about the human. I didn't think about the Sun Eater. I only thought about the fact that the human engineer was right about the Wi-Fi. I hit the launch sequence with 10 seconds to spare. The shuttle kicked away from the dreadnought with a violent jolt that slammed my crest against the reinforced glass. From the viewport of the shuttle, there was no flash. There was no fireball. There was simply a moment where the Sun Eater existed, and then a moment where it was replaced by a spray of molten obsidian and gold dust. The kinetic energy had turned our pride into a shimmering cloud of debris in less time than it takes to blink. I sat in the silence of the pod, my talons still trembling. I thought back to the engine room, to that curling ivory paint I had seen earlier. I realized now what the charcoal script underneath it said. It wasn't graffiti, it was a legacy. The humans had built parts of our own ship during the Great Integration, and they had left a note for themselves. "We've got this," the text had said. I leaned back into the cold pilot's seat. They did have it. They had the math, the momentum, and the terrifying patience to wait for the rest of us to catch up. I looked out at the vast empty space where our fleet had been, and for the first time in my life I didn't care about my reputation or the Sky Dynasty's protocols. I just watched the dust settle. The ivory paint was gone, but the message felt heavier than the tungsten rock that had delivered it.